A tech millionaire who never noticed the elderly maintenance worker suddenly found himself trapped in an elevator, fighting for breath. What the old man revealed next changed both their lives forever. Harold Washington walked through the lobby of Millennium Tower at exactly 6 a.m., just like he had every weekday for the past 8 years. His work boots made soft squeaking sounds against the polished marble floor. The sound echoed off the 30-foot ceilings, bouncing between walls of glass and steel that cost more than his yearly salary. "Morning, Miss Peters," he said to the night shift receptionist, who was gathering her things to leave. She barely looked up from her phone. "Morning." Harold didn't mind. He adjusted his gray maintenance uniform and headed for the employee locker room. His hands, weathered from decades of work, pushed open the metal door. Inside, he swapped his worn jacket for his supervisor badge and radio. The morning routine played out like clockwork. Check the maintenance logs from overnight. Inspect the main systems, review the day's repair tickets. His movements were automatic, practiced over thousands of mornings, but his mind wandered to the phone call with his son last night. "Dad, I don't know if I can keep going," Marcus had said, his voice heavy with defeat. "These student loans, maybe I should just take a break and work full-time." Harold's chest tightened at the memory. He'd spent 30 years as an EMT, saving lives, and now he couldn't even save enough to help his own son through college. The irony wasn't lost on him. The radio crackled. "Mr. Washington, we need you on floor 12. Leak in the bathroom." "Copy that," he responded, his voice steady and professional. As he waited for the service elevator, his late wife's words echoed in his mind. It was one of their last conversations, her hand thin and fragile in his. "Promise me you'll keep being kind," she'd said, "no matter how they treat you. That's what makes you special, Harold." The elevator dinged. Harold stepped inside, pressing the button for floor 12. The leak could wait a few minutes. He had his morning checks to finish first. Back in the lobby at 7:30 a.m., Harold noticed the change in atmosphere. The morning rush was beginning. Executives in tailored suits streamed through the revolving doors, most wearing wireless earbuds, engaged in conversations with invisible partners. That's when he saw James Chen walk in. Harold knew who Chen was, everyone did. 35 years old and worth hundreds of millions after selling his tech startup. He'd moved into the penthouse 3 months ago, and the building had been buzzing about it for weeks. But something was different this morning. Chen's usual confident stride was missing. His skin had a grayish tinge, and a fine sheen of sweat covered his forehead despite the cool morning. His designer suit looked somehow wrong on him, like it was too tight around the neck. Chen stumbled slightly, catching himself on a decorative column. Nobody else seemed to notice. They were all too absorbed in their own worlds. But Harold noticed. 15 years working the back of an ambulance taught you to spot trouble before it happened. Chen pushed away from the column and headed for the executive elevator. His breathing was rapid and shallow. Harold could see his chest rising and falling too quickly even from across the lobby. The elevator doors opened. Chen stepped inside alone. Harold's feet were moving before his brain fully processed the decision. He knew the rules. Maintenance staff weren't supposed to use the executive elevator. He'd probably get written up for this. But he also knew the signs of an impending panic attack. And in an enclosed space like an elevator. "Hold the door," Harold called out, breaking into a light jog. Chen's hand shot out automatically to stop the doors from closing. As Harold slipped inside, their eyes met briefly. Chen's were wide, pupils dilated. Classic sign of sympathetic nervous system activation. The doors slid shut with a soft whoosh. Harold pressed himself into the corner, trying to be as unobtrusive as possible. The elevator was larger than the service ones he usually used, with wood paneling and mirrors that made it feel even more spacious. Still, he could hear Chen's breathing getting worse. They passed the 5th floor when Chen's knees buckled. "Sir?" Harold said, taking a step forward. "Mr. Chen?" Chen raised a hand to wave him off, but the gesture was weak. His other hand clawed at his tie. "Can't." Chen gasped. "Can't breathe." His finger jabbed frantically at several floor buttons before he slumped against the wall, sliding down until he sat on the floor. The elevator shuddered and stopped between floors. Harold knew he had seconds to act. He'd seen this too many times before. Successful people who thought they were invincible until their bodies betrayed them. They were always the hardest to help because they couldn't admit they needed it. He knelt down beside Chun, close enough to help but not so close as to crowd him. "Mr. Chun," he said firmly, "you're having a panic attack. I'm going to help you through this, but you need to trust me. I'm Harold Washington, the maintenance supervisor. I was an EMT for 30 years before this." Chin's eyes locked on Harold's face. The fear in them was raw, primal. His hands shook as they pulled at his collar. "I'm going to loosen your tie," Harold said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Is that okay?" A jerky nod. Harold's fingers, which had saved countless lives over the decades, gently loosened the silk tie. Chin's breathing was still too fast, too shallow. "Good," Harold said. "Now we're going to breathe together. Just like this." He demonstrated a slow, deep breath. Chin tried to copy him, but choked halfway through. "It's okay," Harold said. "Try again. Watch me." Outside the elevator, the world kept spinning. Inside, two men from vastly different worlds sat on the floor, connected by nothing more than the simple act of breathing. And somewhere, Harold thought his wife was smiling. Chin's fingers dug into the expensive wool of his suit pants. Sweat darkened the light gray fabric at his knees. The elevator's LED display blinked between floors 6 and 7, frozen in place just like them. "I don't," Chin gasped. "This never. I can't." "Look at me," Harold said firmly. "Right here." He pointed to his own eyes. "This has happened to other people. Strong people, CEOs, athletes, war veterans. It's just your body's alarm system going off when it doesn't need to." Chin shook his head violently. His watch, probably worth more than Harold's car, caught the overhead light as his hand clutched at his chest. "Heart," Chin managed to say. "You're not having a heart attack," Harold said. He kept his voice steady, the same tone he'd used thousands of times in the back of ambulances. "I know it feels that way, but your pulse is strong, you're conscious, and you're able to talk. This is panic, and panic we can handle." A sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob escaped Chin's throat. "You don't understand. I have meetings, board members flying in. Can't be like this." "Right now, those meetings don't exist," Harold said. "Right now, it's just you and me in this elevator, and we're going to get through this together." Chin's eyes darted around the elevator like a trapped animal. His breathing was getting worse, quick, shallow gasps that would only make the panic worse. Harold remembered his own first panic attack, 6 months after Sarah died. He'd been driving to work, and suddenly the world had collapsed into a tunnel of terror. He'd pulled over, certain he was dying, until a kind stranger had talked him through it. "Mr. Chun," Harold said, "I need you to do something for me. Tell me 5 things you can see right now." "Any 5 things?" Chun stared at him uncomprehendingly. "Come on," Harold prompted. 5 things you can see. Right now." The floor," Chun stammered. "Your shoes. The emergency button. The lights. My hands." "Good," Harold said. "Now 4 things you can touch." Chin's breathing slowed fractionally as he focused on the task. "The wall. My suit. The floor. The air conditioning. 3 things you can hear. The humming. Your voice. My breathing. 2 things you can smell. A shaky breath. Coffee. Someone's perfume maybe. 1 thing you can taste. Mint." Chin swallowed. "Toothpaste." "Good," Harold said. "That's real good. Now we're going to do some breathing. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Like this." Harold demonstrated, counting to 4 on the inhale, holding for 2, then releasing for 6. Chun tried to follow, his breath hitching. "Again," Harold said. "Stay with me." They breathed together in the quiet elevator. Gradually, painfully, Chin's breathing began to steady. Color slowly returned to his face. "I don't." Chin started, then stopped. His voice was hoarse. "This has never happened before. First time for everything," Harold said. "Even panic attacks." Chin's tie hung loose around his neck, his collar open. The perfect crease in his suit pants was ruined from sitting on the floor. He looked younger, somehow more vulnerable. "How did you know?" Chin asked. "What to do?" 30 years as an EMT, Harold said. Saw plenty of panic attacks. Had a few myself after my wife passed. They're not fun, but they're not dangerous. Your body's trying to protect you from a threat that isn't there. Chin nodded slowly. His hands had stopped shaking, but his fingers still gripped his knees. I should get up, he said, but made no move to do so. Take your time, Harold said. No rush. The elevator hummed softly around them. From somewhere above came the muffled sound of other elevators moving, carrying other people through their normal morning routines. I have a board meeting in... Chun checked his watch, then let out a bitter laugh. 20 minutes ago. They can wait, Harold said. Chun looked at him sharply, as if surprised by the directness. For a moment, Harold thought he'd overstepped. But then Chen's expression softened. Yes, he said quietly. I suppose they can. Harold studied him carefully. How's the breathing now? Chen took a deliberate breath. Better. Still feels tight. But better. That's normal. The physical symptoms can linger a bit, like an earthquake having aftershocks. You said... Chen paused. You said you had these too? After your wife? Harold nodded. Sarah. Cancer took her 3 years ago. First panic attack hit me 6 months later, driving to work. Thought I was having a heart attack. Nice lady talked me through it. Just like this. I'm sorry, Chen said. And for the first time that morning, he actually looked at Harold, really looked at him, not through him. Life happens, Harold said. We deal with it. Chun shifted, starting to push himself up. Harold stood first, offering his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Chin took it. His palm was cool and smooth against Harold's callous fingers. Once standing, Chin swayed slightly. Harold kept a steadying hand near his elbow. I should... Chun gestured vaguely at the elevator buttons. Let me, Harold said. He pressed the call button, then the button for the penthouse. The elevator shuddered briefly, then began moving again. They rode in silence for a few floors. Chun straightened his tie, buttoned his collar, tried to restore some semblance of his usual appearance. But his hands weren't quite steady enough to manage the tie properly. May I? Harold asked. Another pause, another nod. Harold stepped forward and efficiently fixed the tie, his movements quick and professional. He'd done this countless times for patients who needed to look presentable after medical emergencies. There, he said, stepping back. Good as new. The elevator slowed as it approached the penthouse level. Chin took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. Mr. Washington, he said formally. Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if. You'd have gotten through it, Harold said. But I'm glad I could help make it easier. The doors opened onto the private penthouse foyer. Chin took a step forward, then stopped. About the board meeting, he said. Already forgotten, Harold assured him. Not my business to remember. Chin nodded slowly. Yes. Well, thank you again. He stepped out of the elevator. Just before the doors closed, he turned back. Mr. Washington? Yes. How often do they happen? The attacks. Harold considered this. Depends on the person. Could be a one-time thing. Could become regular if you don't address what's causing them. I see, Chin said quietly. The doors slid shut between them. Harold rode the elevator back down to the lobby, his mind already turning to the leak on the 12th floor that still needed fixing. But his thoughts kept drifting back to Chin's last question and the fear behind it. The morning sun streamed through the lobby's glass walls, creating patterns on the marble floor. The usual crowd of executives hurried past, none of them aware of what had just transpired in the elevator above them. Harold checked his watch. 8:15 a.m. The day was just beginning. The marble wall no longer supported Chen's weight. His legs gave out completely, and he slid down to the elevator floor again, his breathing becoming more erratic with each passing second. Can't. Chen's fingers clawed at his chest. I can't. Harold moved without hesitation this time, crouching beside the younger man. All social barriers dissolved in the face of immediate need. Listen to me, Harold said, his voice carrying the authority of countless emergency situations. You're going to be okay, but you need to trust me right now. Chen's eyes were wild, darting between Harold's face and the elevator walls that seemed to be closing in. His expensive watch caught the light as his hand trembled. Chen gasped. Need to get out. Look at me, Harold commanded, placing himself directly in Chin's line of sight. The elevator's fine. You're fine. We're going to sit here together until you can breathe properly again. Chun shook his head violently, but Harold pressed on. You know what this reminds me of, he said, keeping his voice steady. My first panic attack. I was driving on the freeway 6 months after my wife passed. Thought I was having a heart attack. Had to pull over right there on the shoulder. Chin's eyes fixed on Harold's face, desperate for something to focus on besides the panic. Want to know what happened next? Harold continued. He didn't wait for a response. This young woman pulled over behind me. She was a kindergarten teacher, of all things. Talked to me for 20 minutes until I could breathe again. Harold demonstrated a deep breath, exaggerating the movement of his chest. Just like this. In through your nose. Hold it. Out through your mouth. Chun tried to copy him, his breath hitching halfway through. That's good, Harold encouraged. Again. We've got nowhere else to be right now. Minutes ticked by. Harold kept talking, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of Chin's panic. You know what's happening in your body right now? Harold asked. Your brain thinks you're in danger. It's trying to protect you. All these symptoms, the racing heart, the sweating, the feeling like you can't breathe, they're just your body's alarm system going off. But there's no real danger here. Chin managed a shaky nod. His breathing was still fast, but no longer the desperate gasps of before. My wife, Harold said softly. She used to say that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let someone help you. Something in Chin's expression shifted at those words. His shoulders sagged, and suddenly he was no longer the millionaire tech executive. He was just a scared young man sitting on an elevator floor. I don't. Chin swallowed hard. I don't like needing help. Nobody does, Harold replied, especially folks used to being in control. A weak laugh escaped Chin's lips. Is it that obvious? Seen it before, Harold said. Type A personalities often have the hardest time with panic attacks. You're used to being able to think your way out of problems. Chin's breathing had steadied enough that he could speak in full sentences now. How did you handle it? After your wife? Harold settled himself more comfortably against the elevator wall. Not well at first. Tried to power through it. Didn't want to admit I needed help. Sound familiar? Chun nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. But you know what I learned? Harold continued. Strength isn't about never needing help. It's about being brave enough to accept it when you do. The elevator hummed softly around them. Chin's breathing had almost returned to normal. Tell me about her, Chin said suddenly. Your wife. Harold blinked, surprised by the request. Sarah? She was something else? Nurse for 30 years. That's how we met. She worked in the ER where I brought patients. She had this way about her. Could calm anyone down just by talking to them. Like you did with me, Chin observed quietly. Learn from the best, Harold smiled. She always said everybody deserves kindness, especially when they're scared. Chin was quiet for a moment, studying his hands. I've worked in this building for 3 months, he said finally. I don't think I've ever really looked at you before today. Most people don't, Harold said simply. Part of the job? That's not right. It is what it is. Chin straightened up slightly, his professional demeanor starting to reassert itself. I should stand up? Take your time, Harold cautioned. No rush. But Chin was already pushing himself to his feet, using the wall for support. Harold rose with him, ready to steady him if needed. Chin swayed slightly, but remained standing. He looked down at his rumpled suit, then at Harold's maintenance uniform. I don't. He started, then stopped. Thank you doesn't seem adequate. It's more than adequate, Harold assured him. How's the breathing now? Chin took a deliberate breath. Better. Much better. Harold nodded. Good. If you start feeling it coming on again, remember the breathing exercises. And maybe consider talking to someone professional about it. No shame in that. Chun straightened his tie. Yes. Perhaps I should. Harold reached for the elevator controls. Which floor? Penthouse, Chin said. Then, after a pause, Mr. Washington? Yes. Would you mind riding up with me? Just in case. Harold pressed the button for the penthouse. Of course. They rode in comfortable silence, the elevator climbing smoothly through the floors. When the doors opened onto the penthouse lobby, Chen stepped out, then turned back. "Mr. Washington," he said formally. "I won't forget this." Harold nodded. "Have a good day, Mr. Chun." The doors closed between them, and Harold began his descent back to his regular duties. He thought about Sarah, about what she would say about this morning's events. "You did good, baby," he could almost hear her say. "You did real good." The elevator deposited him back in the lobby, where the morning rush was in full swing. Nobody noticed the maintenance supervisor stepping out of the executive elevator. Nobody saw the small smile on his face. But somewhere up in the penthouse, a barrier had been broken that couldn't be rebuilt. And both men knew it. The silence in the elevator felt different now. Harold stood in the corner, his hands clasped in front of him, while Chen leaned against the opposite wall. The panic had subsided, but the air between them crackled with unspoken words. "My father," Chen said suddenly, breaking the quiet. He had a saying, "Never let them see you bleed." Harold watched him carefully. "Sounds like a hard way to live." It was. Chun touched his tie, now slightly crooked despite their earlier attempts to fix it. "Is." The elevator continued its smooth ascent. Floor numbers ticked by on the digital display. 45, 46, 47. "My board meeting started 15 minutes ago," Chen said, checking his watch. 12 people sitting in my conference room, probably checking their phones and wondering where I am. "You could tell them the truth," Harold suggested. Chun let out a short, harsh laugh. "That I had a panic attack in an elevator? That I needed the maintenance supervisor to talk me through breathing exercises? They'd have me removed by tomorrow morning." "You'd be surprised," Harold said. "Had a CEO as a patient once. Found him having a panic attack in his car outside the emergency room. Know what he did? Walked into his next meeting and told everyone exactly what happened. Said it was the most respected he'd ever felt." Chen was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "Was that when you were an EMT?" Harold nodded. 30 years of it. Seen pretty much everything. Why did you stop?" The question hung in the air. Harold felt the familiar tightness in his chest when he thought about those final days. "Sarah, my wife, she got sick," he said finally. "Cancer. Needed someone to care for her. This job, it let me set my own schedule, be there when she needed me." Chen's expression softened. "I'm sorry. That must have been difficult." "Life happens," Harold shrugged. "We adapt." The elevator slowed as it approached the penthouse. Chun straightened his jacket, a reflexive gesture. "Mr. Washington," he said, his voice formal again. "About what happened?" "Already forgotten," Harold assured him. "No," Chen said sharply. "No, it shouldn't be forgotten." He ran a hand through his hair, messing it up further. "I've worked in this building for 3 months. Passed you probably dozens of times. Never even looked at you. And then today." The elevator doors opened onto the private penthouse foyer. Neither man moved. "You know what I was thinking about?" Chen continued. "When it was happening, all I could think was, I'm going to die in this elevator, and nobody will even know who I really am. Just another rich guy who worked too hard and burned out too fast." Harold studied him. "Is that who you really are?" Chen smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I don't even know anymore." He took a step toward the doors, then stopped. "I have to go to this meeting." "But, would you?" "Yes." "Would you have coffee with me sometime? Tell me more about your experiences. With the panic attacks. How you dealt with them." Harold blinked, surprised. Yes, of course. If you think it would help." Chun nodded. "Tomorrow morning? The cafe on the ground floor? I start work at 6 a.m. 6:30 then. If that works for you." Harold nodded. 6:30, Chen stepped out of the elevator. Just before the doors closed, he turned back. "Thank you, Mr. Washington, for everything." The doors slid shut, leaving Harold alone in the elevator. He pressed the button for the lobby, his mind already turning to the day's tasks ahead. But something had shifted like a gear clicking into place. The morning sun streamed through the lobby's glass walls when he returned, creating long shadows across the marble floor. The usual crowd of executives hurried past, absorbed in their phones and conversations. Harold's radio crackled. "Mr. Washington, we need you on the 12th floor. That leak is getting worse." "Copy that," he responded, already heading for the service elevator. "On my way." As he walked, he noticed Miss Peters at the reception desk giving him an odd look. He realized he'd just stepped out of the executive elevator, Again. Everything okay? She asked. You don't usually? Everything's fine, he said, offering a small smile. Just helping someone who needed it. The service elevator doors opened with a ding that seemed louder than usual. Harold stepped inside, pressed the button for 12, and watched the lobby disappear behind closing doors. In his pocket, his phone vibrated. A text from Marcus, his son. Dad, got a minute to talk about school? Harold looked at the message, thinking about Chin's words in the elevator. About letting people see you bleed. About asking for help. He typed back, always got time for you, son. Call me on your lunch break. The service elevator wasn't as smooth as the executive one. It rattled slightly as it ascended, the sound familiar after 8 years. But today, even this felt different somehow. Harold touched his pocket where his phone sat, thinking about Marcus. About Chun. About Sarah. You'd like him, he whispered to the empty elevator, imagining Sarah's response. Once he got past all that armor he wears, the elevator stopped at 12, doors opening onto a puddle of water seeping from under a bathroom door. Harold pulled out his tools, ready to tackle the leak. But his mind kept drifting back to the executive elevator, to the moment when all the barriers between maintenance supervisor and millionaire had crumbled away, leaving just two human beings sharing the same air, the same fear, the same need for connection. Tomorrow morning at 6:30, they would meet again. And maybe, just maybe, something new would begin. The maintenance office felt smaller than usual as Harold packed up for the day. The clock on the wall read 5:45 p.m., and the evening shift had already taken over. He gathered his personal belongings from his locker, movements slow and deliberate. His phone buzzed. Marcus. Hey, Dad. His son's voice came through tired but warm. Hey, son. How was class? A heavy sigh crackled through the speaker. That's actually why I'm calling. I got the tuition bill for next semester. Dad, it's gone up again. Harold sat down on the metal bench, his work boots scuffing against the concrete floor. How much? Another 15%. I don't. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. I don't know how much longer I can do this. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Harold closed his eyes. We'll figure something out, son. We always do. Maybe I should take a break. Work for a year. Save up some money. No. Harold's voice was firm. You keep going. Let me worry about the money. Dad. I mean it, Marcus. Your mother wanted this for you. I want this for you. The silence on the other end stretched out. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his voice small. I miss her, Dad. Me too, son. Every day. After they hung up, Harold sat in the empty locker room for a long moment. The day's events played through his mind. Chun collapsed in the elevator, the fear in his eyes, the way social barriers had melted away in the face of human need. His phone showed 6:15 p.m. when he finally left the building. The evening air was cool against his face as he walked to the employee parking lot. His old Toyota sat alone in the corner, paint faded from years in the sun. The drive home was quiet. Traffic had thinned out, and Harold's thoughts wandered to tomorrow's coffee meeting with Chun. What would they talk about? Would the morning light erase whatever connection had formed in that elevator? His apartment was dark when he unlocked the door. One bedroom, basic furniture, walls still decorated with photos Sarah had chosen years ago. He didn't have the heart to change anything. In the kitchen, he opened the refrigerator, stared at its sparse contents, and closed it again. Instead, he pulled Sarah's old journal from the bookshelf. The leather was worn smooth from years of handling. Harold settled into his armchair and opened to a blank page. You wouldn't believe the day I had, baby, he wrote. Remember how you always said everyone deserves kindness? Well, today I found out just how right you were. Across town, in his penthouse apartment, James Chun stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the city lights below. His suit jacket lay discarded on a designer couch, tie loose around his neck. The board meeting had been a blur. He'd walked in 45 minutes late, apologized briefly for a medical issue, and proceeded as if nothing had happened. Nobody questioned it. Nobody dared. But now, alone in his apartment, the facade cracked. His hand shook slightly as he poured himself a drink. The crystal tumbler caught the light, sending prisms dancing across the marble countertop. Chun opened his laptop, the screen casting a blue glow across his face. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing. Panic attack symptoms, the search results filled his screen. Medical websites, support forums, personal stories. He clicked through them mechanically, reading about triggers, treatments, coping mechanisms. One link led to another, and suddenly he found himself reading about EMTs and their experiences with panic attack patients. Stories of calming people down in crisis, of being the steady hand in someone's darkest moment. Chin minimized the browser and pulled up his company's employee directory. He scrolled through names and faces until he found what he was looking for. Harold Washington, maintenance supervisor, start date. 8 years ago, previous employment. Emergency medical technician, 30 years. The photo showed Harold in his gray uniform, expression serious but kind. Chin stared at it for a long moment. His phone lay on the counter, screen dark. He picked it up, debating whether to send an email, canceling tomorrow's coffee meeting. It would be easier, safer. He could thank Harold with a gift card or a bonus, maintain professional distance. But something stopped him. Instead, he found himself searching for Harold's son, Marcus Washington, pre-med student at the local university. Social media showed a young man with his father's kind eyes and his mother's warm smile. Recent posts mentioned student loans, rising tuition costs, the struggle to stay in school. Chin set his phone down and walked back to the windows. The city stretched out below him, millions of lives intersecting in countless ways. Somewhere out there, Harold was probably getting ready for bed, preparing for another early morning. Tomorrow at 6:30 a.m., they would meet for coffee. Two men from different worlds, connected by a moment of crisis in an elevator. Chun touched his chest where the panic had gripped him earlier. The memory was still fresh, still raw, but something else lingered too. The steady sound of Harold's voice, the feeling of not being alone. He loosened his tie completely and let it fall to the floor. Tomorrow would come soon enough. In his modest apartment, Harold closed Sarah's journal and put it back on the shelf. He had an early morning ahead, but sleep felt distant. He picked up his phone one last time, opening the message from Marcus. "Love you, son," he typed. "Don't give up." The response came quickly. "Love you too, Dad." Harold set his alarm for 5 a.m. and got ready for bed. As he lay in the darkness, he thought about Chin's words in the elevator. "I've worked in this building for 3 months. Never even looked at you." Tomorrow, they would look at each other. Really look, and maybe that would make all the difference. The numbers on Chin's bedside clock glowed. 3:27 a.m. Sleep hadn't come. His mind kept replaying the elevator scene, the feeling of walls closing in, the sound of Harold's steady voice guiding him back to reality. He pushed off the silk sheets and walked to his home office. The city lights twinkled outside his window, a constellation of artificial stars. His laptop hummed to life. Chin's fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up financial records, bank statements, investment portfolios. Numbers scrolled across the screen, each representing a fraction of his wealth. "Computer, call Robert," he commanded. The phone rang 3 times before his lawyer answered, voice thick with sleep. "James? It's the middle of the night. I need you to set up a scholarship fund. Full ride, medical school. And I need it done by morning." Silence on the other end. Then, "Are you okay?" "This isn't like you." "I'm fine." Chin's voice was firm. "Can you do it?" "Of course, but dash good. Send me the paperwork as soon as it's ready." "And Robert?" Complete anonymity on this one. He ended the call and turned back to his computer. More searches, more numbers, more plans taking shape in his mind. Across town, Harold's alarm buzzed at 5 a.m. He dressed in his usual uniform, made coffee, read his morning devotional. Normal routine, abnormal day. The drive to work felt different. The same streets, the same traffic lights, but everything tinged with anticipation. He parked in his usual spot at 5:45 a.m. The building was quiet. Night shift preparing to leave. Day shift not yet arrived. His footsteps echoed in the empty lobby. "Morning, Mr. Washington," the night security guard called out. "Morning, Tom. Quiet night." "Same as always." Harold headed to the maintenance office, checked the overnight logs, picked up his radio. Then, instead of starting his rounds, he walked to the employee locker room. Inside his locker, hanging next to his spare uniform, was Sarah's photo. He touched it gently. "Wish you could see this, baby," he whispered. At 6:25 a.m., Harold entered the ground floor cafe. The morning rush hadn't started yet, just a few early birds getting coffee before work. Chun was already there. He sat at a corner table, wearing a casual sweater instead of his usual suit. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd slept as little as Harold had. "Mr. Washington," Chun stood as Harold approached. "Thank you for coming." "Harold," he corrected, sitting down. "Just Harold is fine." A barista appeared with 2 cups of coffee. Chun must have ordered ahead. "I didn't know how you take it," Chun said. "I got cream and sugar on the side." Harold added a splash of cream to his cup. "Thank you." They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet buzz of the cafe filling the space between them. "I couldn't sleep last night," Chun said finally. "Kept thinking about yesterday. About what you said in the elevator." Harold waited, letting him find the words. "You said strength isn't about never needing help." Chun stared into his coffee. "I've spent my whole life believing the opposite. My father. He taught me that weakness was a luxury we couldn't afford." "Sounds lonely," Harold said quietly. Chun looked up, surprised. "Yes, I suppose it was. Is." More silence. The cafe began to fill with early morning customers. "Tell me about your son," Chun said suddenly. Harold's hands tightened around his cup. "Marcus? He's in medical school. 2nd year. Wants to be an emergency room doctor. Like mother, like son?" "Yeah." Harold smiled. "Has Sarah's heart. That's for sure. And the student loans?" Harold's smile faded. "Getting harder every semester. But we'll manage. We always do." Chun nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision. He reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a manila envelope. "I had my lawyer work through the night," he said, sliding the envelope across the table. "It's all set up. Anonymous donor, full ride scholarship, medical school, living expenses, everything." Harold stared at the envelope but didn't touch it. "Mr. Chun." James. Harold took a deep breath. "I can't accept this." "You can. You will." Chun's voice was firm. "You saved me yesterday. Let me do this. I did my job. Nothing more. Your job is maintaining this building, not talking down panic-stricken CEOs in elevators." Chun leaned forward. "Please, let me do this one thing." Harold's hands shook slightly as he picked up the envelope. "Why?" "Because yesterday, for the first time in years, someone saw me as a person, not a portfolio." Chun's voice cracked slightly. "Because your wife was right. Everyone deserves kindness. Even rich jerks who never look maintenance workers in the eye." The cafe had filled up now. Regular customers. Regular morning, but nothing felt regular anymore. "Marcus." Harold's voice was rough. "He's wanted to be a doctor since he was 10. Watching Sarah work in the ER, seeing how she helped people, then let him be a doctor." Chun pushed the envelope closer. "Let him help people like you helped me." Harold opened the envelope slowly. The paperwork inside was official, legal, binding. A full-ride scholarship, anonymously funded, already approved by the university. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let your son become a doctor." Chun smiled. "Say you'll have coffee with me again sometime. Say you'll keep being the kind of person who helps others even when they don't deserve it." Harold carefully folded the envelope and put it in his pocket. "Thank you," he said simply. "No." Chun stood up, gathering his things. "Thank you." They walked together to the lobby, where the morning rush was beginning. Chun headed for the executive elevator while Harold turned toward the maintenance office. "Harold?" Chun called after him. "Yes." "Same time tomorrow?" Harold smiled. "Same time tomorrow." They went their separate ways. One up to his penthouse office, one to his maintenance duties. But something had changed permanently and irrevocably. In Harold's pocket, the envelope felt warm, full of promise and possibility. He touched it gently, thinking of Marcus, of Sarah, of the strange paths life sometimes took. His radio crackled. "Mr. Washington, we need you on floor 15. "Copy that," he responded. "On my way." The day was just beginning. The scholarship papers felt heavy in Harold's hands as he sat in his maintenance office, reading through them for the 3rd time. Every detail was perfectly arranged: full tuition, living expenses, books, even a stipend for research opportunities. His phone buzzed. "Marcus." Harold's throat tightened. He answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Hey, son. Dad?" You okay? You sounded weird in your message. I'm fine. Better than fine. Harold looked at the papers again. Son, I need you to come by the building after your classes today. There's something we need to discuss. Is everything all right? Everything's perfect. Just come by around 4. The hours crawled by. Harold went through his routine, fixing leaks, checking systems, responding to maintenance calls. But his mind kept drifting to the envelope in his desk drawer. At 3:55 p.m., his radio crackled. Mr. Washington, your son is in the lobby. Thanks, Tom. Send him up. Marcus appeared in the maintenance office doorway, looking worried. He had Sarah's eyes, Harold thought. The same kind expression. Dad? What's going on? Harold pulled out the envelope. Sit down, son. Marcus sat, his med school textbooks clutched to his chest. You're scaring me. Nothing to be scared of. Harold handed him the envelope. Open it. Marcus pulled out the papers, his eyes scanning the first page. Then the second. His hands started shaking. Dad, what is this? It's your future, son. Harold's voice was rough with emotion. Full ride scholarship. Everything covered. But how? Anonymous donor. Harold watched his son's face. Someone who believes in helping others. Marcus read through the papers again, his eyes wide. This can't be real. It's real. Already approved by the university. Harold leaned forward. You don't have to worry about money anymore, son. You can just focus on becoming a doctor. Tears welled up in Marcus's eyes. Mom would have. He couldn't finish the sentence. She would have been so proud. Harold stood up, pulling his son into a tight hug. She is proud. They stayed like that for a long moment, father and son holding each other in the small maintenance office. I don't understand, Marcus said finally, wiping his eyes. Why would someone do this? Why me? Harold thought of Chun in the elevator, vulnerable and human. Sometimes people just want to help, like your mother always did. A knock at the door made them both turn. Chun stood in the doorway, wearing his usual suit, but looking somehow different, more approachable. Sorry to interrupt, he said. Mr. Washington, do you have a moment? Marcus gathered his things quickly. I should go. Dad, thank you. I don't know what you did, but thank you. He hugged his father once more, nodded to Chun, and left the office. Harold watched him go, his heart full. He looks like you, Chun said quietly. Has his mother's heart, though. Harold turned to face him. I thought this was supposed to be anonymous. It is, officially. Chun sat down in the chair Marcus had vacated. But I needed to see his face when he found out. Harold studied him. Why? Because yesterday in that elevator you saw me. Really saw me. Not my money, not my position, just a scared man who needed help. Chin's voice was soft. Do you know how rare that is? It's what anyone would have done. No. Chun shook his head. It's what you did, what your wife would have done, and what your son will do as a doctor. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the building's systems filling the small office. He's wanted this since he was 10, Harold said finally. Watching Sarah in the ER, seeing how she helped people, now he can. Chun stood up. No loans, no stress, no impossible choices. Just healing people like you healed me. Harold felt tears threatening. I don't know how to thank you. Don't. Chun moved to the door. Just coffee again tomorrow? Same time? Same time. After Chun left, Harold sat alone in his office. He pulled out Sarah's journal, opened to a fresh page. Baby, he wrote, you wouldn't believe what happened today. Remember how you always said kindness comes back to you? Well, his radio crackled, bringing him back to the present. Mr. Washington, need you on 12? Harold tucked the journal away and stood up. He had work to do, but everything felt lighter somehow, as if a weight he'd carried for years had finally lifted. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Dad, I still can't believe this. Mom would be so happy right now. Harold typed back, she is, son. She is. The maintenance office had never felt warmer, despite the fluorescent lights and concrete walls. Harold gathered his tools, ready to tackle whatever problem waited on the 12th floor. But first, he touched the photo of Sarah on his desk. You were right, baby, he whispered. Kindness really does change everything. The elevator dinged, ready to carry him up to his next task. Just another day's work in a building that suddenly felt a lot more like home. Harold's phone rang at 5:45 a.m., just as he pulled into his parking spot at Millennium Tower. Marcus's name lit up the screen. "Son? Everything okay?" "Dad, I just got out of a meeting with my advisor." Marcus's voice trembled with excitement. "She says with the scholarship, I can join the research program I wanted. The one working on emergency trauma care." Harold closed his eyes, letting the joy in his son's voice wash over him. "Your mother would have loved that. I keep pinching myself. It doesn't feel real." From his spot in the parking lot, Harold could see Chin's black SUV already parked in its reserved space. "Believe it, son. It's real. I have to go. Early rounds." "But, Dad." "Yeah. I love you." "Love you too, son." Harold walked into the lobby, his work boots squeaking against the marble floor. The morning light streamed through the glass walls, creating long shadows. Chin was already at their usual table in the cafe, 2 coffee cups waiting. "How's Marcus?" he asked as Harold sat down. "Excited. He just got approved for a research program." Harold added cream to his coffee. "Something about emergency trauma care." Chin smiled, following in his parents' footsteps. "Yeah." Harold took a sip of coffee. He asked me again about the scholarship. Who would do something like that?" "What did you tell him?" "That sometimes people just want to help, like his mother did." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the lobby come to life. Early morning workers trickled in, most heading straight for the coffee counter. "My father called last night," Chin said suddenly. "First time in months?" Harold waited, letting him continue. He asked about the company, the stock prices, the next quarter's projections. Chin stared into his coffee. Not once did he ask how I was doing. "That must be hard." "You know what's harder? I used to be just like him." Chin looked up. All numbers, no humanity. "Then I had a panic attack in an elevator, and a maintenance supervisor showed me more kindness in 10 minutes than my father has in 35 years. The morning rush was picking up. People hurried past their table, absorbed in phones and conversations. "Sarah, my wife," Harold said slowly. "She used to say that everyone's carrying something heavy. We just can't always see it. Smart woman. The smartest." Harold checked his watch. "I should start my rounds?" They stood up together. Chin straightened his tie, a gesture that now seemed more habit than necessity. "Harold?" "Yeah." "Thank you. Not just for the elevator. For this." Chin gestured between them. "For seeing me." They walked to the elevators together. Chin to the executive car, Harold to the service elevator. But before they parted, Chin turned back. "Same time tomorrow?" "Wouldn't miss it." The day unfolded like any other, but small things had changed. Residents who used to look through Harold now nodded hello. The receptionist asked about Marcus. Even the security guard seemed different, more friendly. Word had gotten around somehow, not about the scholarship, but about what happened in the elevator. How the maintenance supervisor had helped the penthouse resident. How barriers had broken down. Around lunchtime, Harold's radio crackled. "Mr. Washington, Mr. Chin would like to see you in his office." The executive elevator felt familiar now as it carried him to the penthouse level. Chin's secretary waved him straight in. The office was all glass and chrome, with views of the city stretching to the horizon. Chin stood at the window, hands in his pockets. "I've been thinking," he said without turning around. "About what you said, about everyone carrying something heavy." "Yeah. I want to start a program here in the building. Mental health support, counseling, whatever people need." Now Chin turned to face him. Would you help me set it up? Share your experiences?" Harold thought about Sarah, about how she always said one act of kindness could multiply endlessly. "I'd be honored." They spent the next hour talking details, how to make it accessible, how to remove the stigma, how to help people feel safe asking for help. When Harold finally left, Chin called after him. "Oh, and Harold, the executive elevator? It's yours to use. Anytime." Back in his maintenance office, Harold opened Sarah's journal. "Baby," he wrote, "remember how you always said everyone deserves a chance to be seen? Well, today." His phone buzzed with another text from Marcus. "Dad, just finished my first research meeting. This is everything Mom ever wanted for me. Thank you." Harold closed the journal, touched Sarah's photo, and picked up his radio. He had work to do, people to help, a building to maintain. But everything felt different now. Better, warmer, more human. The elevator dinged. ready to carry him to his next task. And somewhere, he knew Sarah was smiling. 1 month later, Harold stood in the lobby of Millennium Tower at exactly 6 a.m., just like always. But today was different. "Morning, Harold." Miss Peters called from the reception desk. "Big day, huh?" "Big day," he agreed, heading for the cafe. Chun already sat at their usual table, 2 coffees waiting. He wore a casual sweater instead of his usual suit. "Ready?" Chun asked as Harold sat down. "As I'll ever be." Today was the official launch of the Millennium Tower Wellness Program. Posters hung in the lobby announcing free counseling services, support groups, and mental health resources for all building employees and residents. "Mark is coming?" Chun sipped his coffee. "Yeah, his first presentation as a medical student." Harold smiled. "He's nervous." Like father, like son. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the lobby come to life. A month had changed so much. Residents greeted Harold by name. Maintenance staff used the executive elevator without hesitation. The invisible barriers that once divided the building had begun to crumble. Harold's phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Just parked. Nervous as hell." "He's here," Harold said, standing up. They met Marcus in the lobby. He wore a white coat over his clothes, a stethoscope around his neck. "Mr. Chun." Marcus extended his hand. "Thank you for having me." "James, please." Chun shook his hand. "And thank you for being part of this." The conference room on the 40th floor filled quickly. Building employees, residents, even some board members. Harold sat in the back, watching his son set up his presentation on panic attacks and mental health first aid. Chun stepped to the podium first. "A month ago," he began, "I had a panic attack in the elevator. I thought I was dying, but someone helped me. Someone I'd passed 100 times without really seeing." The room was silent, all eyes on Chun. "Harold Washington taught me that strength isn't about never needing help. It's about being brave enough to accept it when you do." Harold felt eyes turning to him, but he kept watching Chun. "Today, we're launching something new, something that would make Sarah Washington proud." At his wife's name, Harold's throat tightened. "The Sarah Washington Memorial Wellness Program," Chun continued. "Because everyone deserves to be seen. Everyone deserves kindness." Marcus took the podium next, his voice steady as he began his presentation. Harold watched his son speak with confidence about panic attacks, about the importance of mental health, about breaking down stigma. Sarah would have loved this, he thought. After the presentation, people lingered, talking in small groups. Chun worked the room, answering questions about the program. Marcus was surrounded by medical students who'd come to support him. Harold slipped out quietly, heading for the elevator. He had maintenance rounds to start. The executive elevator opened. Chun stepped in just before the doors closed. "Running away?" Chun asked. "Work to do. The building can wait 5 minutes." Chun pressed the stop button. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For that day in the elevator. For seeing me." "For?" Chun gestured vaguely. "For everything." Harold thought about that day, about how a moment of crisis had broken down walls built over decades. "My wife," he said slowly, "she always said crisis shows us who we really are. Smart woman. The smartest." The elevator resumed its descent. When it reached the lobby, both men stepped out. "Coffee tomorrow?" Chun asked. "Same time, same place." Harold headed for his office, checking his phone. A text from Marcus. "Mom would have loved this, Dad." "Yes," he typed back. "She would." The morning sun streamed through the lobby's glass walls, creating patterns on the marble floor. The usual crowd of executives hurried past, but now some nodded to Harold, smiled, saw him. His radio crackled. "Mr. Washington, need you on 15? "Copy that," he responded. "On my way." Before heading to the elevator, Harold touched the new plaque on the wall. The Sarah Washington Memorial Wellness Program. Because everyone deserves kindness. The elevator dinged, doors opening. Inside, a young executive looked pale, breathless. "You okay?" Harold asked, stepping in. The executive shook his head. "Just feeling a bit." Harold pressed the stop button. "It's okay," he said gently. "I know what this is. I can help." The elevator hummed softly around them as Harold began the familiar breathing exercises. Above them, Sarah's plaque caught the morning light. And somewhere, Harold knew, she was smiling. The world kept spinning, lives intersecting in countless ways. In the medical school across town, Marcus prepared for his next class. In his penthouse office, Chin worked on expanding the wellness program to other buildings. And in an elevator between floors, Harold Washington did what he'd always done: help people who needed it, one breath at a time. Some things he thought come full circle.